We speak with Western Australian Liberal Party MP Dr. Steve Thomas about the political reaction to WA's gun laws and the importance of the upcoming WA gun rally.
Answers. I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
Welcome to the Gun News Australia podcast. It's the podcast for Australian shooters who just want the political interference taken out of shooting.
So welcome to another episode of Gun News Australia, brought to you by Politics Reloaded and Gun Traders Australia. And I have a familiar face with me, Steve Thomas from Western Australia. Steve, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Neil. Welcome to Western Australia again.
Okay. So, Dr. Steve Thomas, you're a member of the Liberal Party and you actually represent the Southwest region, which is sort of Albany down through to Busselton, Bunbury and Warrenwood, those sort of places. Yeah. I think the last time we spoke, you're a former Victorian, born in Mansfield. You spent some time in Queensland, and obviously you, I don't know if you saw the light or ran away from the light, but you ended up in Western Australia, and that was a while ago. So how long have you been there?
I've been here 35 years, roughly. So, yes, born in Victoria, but very young when the family left. I grew up in Queensland, studied at the University of Queensland, came to Western Australia in 1989 as a veterinarian and still a veterinarian 35 years later. I don't do a lot of practicing. I do a lot of politics these days, but I like to say I keep an arm in. I keep operating.
Yeah. And in terms of shooting, I think you said that that's sort of part of, I guess, your work life as well, that you've had to do with firearms. Do you do any other sort of shooting or any other involvement?
So I've done quite a lot of, I guess, recreational shooting over the years, mostly feral animals, so from rabbits to the odd wild pig, etc. There's a bit of a range of feral animals here in Western Australia. Growing up in Queensland, of course, there was, and on a farm, so I've been a farm kid and I've lived for some time in the city, but then back on a small, let's call it a hobby farm in the southwest. So there are still issues that I had growing up that I have now. That is feral pests. So we have plenty of rabbits. We have feral pigs in my patch for the first time this year. So that's something new that I've got to deal with. And then we obviously get the other ferals that come around, foxes, plenty of, feral cats on occasions, etc., etc. So my whole life's been involved in animals, and a part of that has been using firearms. I've been a firearm user since very young.
Any ranges out your way?
There are a couple in the southwest, not as many as there used to be, of course. You go up towards Boyart Brook, there's some out there. There's a couple of ranges still in the southwest corner. I'm not really a competitive shooter as such. I use them as tools. I had a firearm, obviously, for vetting, and so that's more my thing.
You'll have to touch Mr. Dutton up for a bit of money for, I think, a super range out your way when he comes by.
Okay, we'll see how we go.
Okay, so now we're going to get into the more serious issue. The reason why we're talking with you is the passage of the Firearms Act in WA, which has had, I think, an enormous amount of impact on and attention by the shooting community. So what we're talking about here is the move by the Western Australian government through Paul Papalia to impose restrictions on gun ownership, the number of guns, the type of guns that you can own, the calibers you can and can't have, property letters. There was that buyback where they offered dirt cheap prices to take guns off people. There was the introduction of mental and physical health checks, the safe requirements, which have come out now in the detail of the regulations, which are going to be quite onerous on gun owners, having a minimum of 6 mil doors and 3 mil thick sides, and I just did a recent interview about that, and there's a bit of new information that's come in. Of course, you have to consider access, you have to consider stairs and whether the stairs are rated to take safes going up and down them, and the lifting equipment, all that sort of stuff, and higher fees as well that are hidden in the back of the regulations. So it's a really nasty, and the penalties attached to that include $5,000, for the first offence if you don't have the right safe, and potentially imprisonment after that. So this is a really, really big, horrible package. There is no good news at all for anyone in this. Now, your position, I'll get your view on that in a second, but can you just talk about your view of that package and the position you took when this all went to Parliament?
So yes, I think it's a dreadful outcome, and that's why I was the Liberal that opposed these gun laws when they were introduced, and I voted against them at every opportunity in the Parliament, and I remain opposed to the impact that they have. Now, there was obviously an opportunity to improve the existing gun laws. There were a few things that needed to be fixed. For example, nobody should be able to sell thousands of recreational shooting letters on a property, basically, when you know that there's not those thousands of people going to turn up. So there were a few people who were rorting the existing system. But you could have fixed those, Neil, without going to the extent that the government has. So I describe it like this. These changes are not to fix the problems that were in the previous legislation. These changes introduced by the Labor Party are specifically designed to take every gun off every gun owner that they possibly can. And they'll do it on a number of ways. They will take it off you through making it more difficult. They'll take it off you by increasing the cost. They will make it both expensive and problematic for you to maintain your licenses. And they are simply on an agenda to remove every firearm from every law-abiding, legal and well-operated and well-meaning firearms owner that they possibly can. And that is without doubt the intent of these gun laws. Now, that's what I said when the legislation came to the Parliament, which I said I cannot support gun laws that are specifically designed to undermine the rights of honest and legitimate and well-meaning and regulated firearms owners. And so I've opposed the legislation all the way through. What I did say at the time, though, Neil, was, and I said it a few times, was that the regulations, when they arrive, will be worse than the legislation. And this government has some history in this. So when we debated the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Bill in Western Australia, for example, a bill that basically took the private property rights off massive numbers of landowners in Western Australia. In fact, anybody who owned more than a quarter-acre block was effectively going to have their land rights completely disabled. This is a smaller group, obviously, but they're doing the same thing now to gun owners. Now, that was a big group of people in Aboriginal cultural heritage, and after a few weeks of operation, that whole piece of legislation had to be turfed out, thrown out. The government itself worked out how bad it was and threw it out. In this circumstance, it's a smaller group of people. Instead of being probably 500,000 plus people in Aboriginal cultural heritage, it's 100,000 licensed firearms owners. But it is still an impact on their individual rights, and that's the problem. I mean, you know, this is the old socialist agenda where they're taking away your authority and your power, and you have to go cap in hand to try and do the things that you have done perfectly legally and perfectly safely in many cases for decades.
Yeah. And you voted, as you said, you voted against the legislation. Some of your party colleagues abstained from voting. Clearly, this was a very hot issue in the party room.
Yes, so some members, I mean, this is public knowledge. The majority of members voted for the legislation. A couple of members abstained. Two members abstained, and then 2 members voted against the legislation.
Okay. And yet the leadership of the party, and I will pull it up here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it sort of where you are, but this is an extract from the webpage from Libby Mettam. So her position, she says, to be clear, is on her website. To be clear, the WA Liberals will not repeal these laws. But you've got people in the party who are taking a very different approach on that. And I would like to think the passage of time might actually persuade some people that maybe some adjustment of that position might be needed.
So, Neil, obviously, I mean, I have taken a position of opposing this legislation, but it's not just up to me. There has to be consensus across the board. And ultimately, if this legislation is to change in a new parliament, whether it's the next one or the one after that or a one in the future, there will have to be enough members elected who do not take a left-wing socialist bent to their politics. Now that's potentially pretty difficult to deliver across two houses of parliament and a whole range of parties. The next parliament is likely to be a much more diverse one. There's likely to be a much greater range of MPs involved. Now there will probably be fewer Labor MPs, but there's probably going to be more Greens MPs, for example. We may well get a Shooter and Fisher party elected, and I suspect One Nation, and they will, I think, take a fairly sensible view. But at the same time we'll get other parties that probably take a more extreme view. So this is a complicated process. I'm not going to be able to, on my own bat, deliver any particular outcome. And I don't think anybody can. Nobody at this point can say, apart from the Labor Party, that a specific outcome is deliverable. What we can do is stand on our principles and say, these are the principles that I believe in, and this is what I think should happen. Whether that happens in the future, as most people know, you can promise all you like, but if you don't have the authority to deliver it, it doesn't really matter. So I'm not interested in promising outcomes. I'm telling the community in Western Australia what I will stand for.
For those who say our gun laws are okay, no, they're not okay. It's not okay for police to make the rules or for guns to be banned for the weakest of reasons, or to go after shooters just because they wear glasses. It's not okay to use duck season as a political football, or to close our gun shops without reason, or for politicians to use us as a battering ram. No, our gun laws are not okay. Just to recap for those people who may not be aware, I'm going to show the number of seats that are held by Labor and well, not really a formal coalition, I appreciate that, but from the last election in 21, we've got the Labor that's picked up 53 seats in the lower house. The Liberal Party, National Party has 6 between them. You look at that and you think, how can you possibly, extract from that? But I do make the point. That was straight after the peak of the COVID lockdowns. People were scared. They really they were backing governments because it was a safe thing to do, and that influence is gone. So I do think when you look at some of the marginal seats, and I'm going to show now the pendulum, which shows the margins of seats held by Labor, and this is from the ABC website. There's a lot of seats that are sitting below 10%. There's a few under 5%, but there's, I don't know, a bit less than 20.
10 seats under 10%.
Yeah. I mean, and that means if you take away that COVID influence, let's say it's, I don't know what it's worth, 6, 7, 8%, whatever it is, those seats are gone without any other issues coming into play here. So that 53, that can come down very quickly.
Well, we obviously hope that that's the case. But to be honest with you, Neil, I don't think that the people who are legitimate, honest firearm owners in Western Australia can simply sit around and wait for a political outcome on this one. We actually have to have a bit more campaigning going on this. We need to take some of our, more conservative, socially, not politically, city cousins with us along this particular debate. Now, bear in mind, there are plenty of city people who are recreational shooters who are the absolute target of the state government with this particular piece of legislation. The farming community got a better run out of it than recreational shooters in the city. And I have to say, I have candidates come to me all the time, Neil, from a state and federal perspective, who say these firearm laws are one of the most common things that are raised when we go door knocking. We knock on doors and people say the firearms legislation is damaging this part of our family. It is a really big issue for Western Australia, and we need to make sure that it is still a really big issue for Western Australians.
I will get on in a moment onto the rally that's being organised, and that is definitely the feedback we're getting. Before I do that, you mentioned city-centric and city population. I'm going to show, I did this last time I interviewed you, which was quite a while ago, but I'm going to do it again. I'm going to show one of the maps that the Western Australian Police produced when they quite unreasonably put these maps into the media. What we're looking at here is, this is a map produced by Western Australia Police, as you can see at the bottom left-hand corner here. This shows the location of licensed shooters in Perth. Now, the reason why this map was done was it was a scare campaign by the police minister to scare the the Western Australia, the Perth population into supporting, the new gun laws. But what it did, and I keep coming back to this, it actually shows you and any political operatives where the shooters' votes can be earned. Yeah, sure. There might be a lot of shooting done out in the country areas. People go off for weekend hunting, target shooting or something. But have a look at where they actually live, which is where they vote. So if the Liberal Party, and I'm speaking to you, Libby Midham, if the Liberal Party thinks that there's no votes in the city area, they are wrong. Those people, they are the ones being affected by the gun laws.
Well, no, and I agree. So, like I say, when I say candidates who are door knocking and coming to me saying we've got an issue, and it's one of the biggest ones is gun laws, and that's coming from the metropolitan area as much as it is from regional areas. So yes, it is absolutely a problem. You made a good point before, Neil, that the last election based on COVID, for example, the government ran a very good scare campaign on COVID. One of my problems with the current legislation is the government's run a scare campaign on firearms. And that's exactly what they've been doing. So, and that's why the front page of the newspaper had pictures of maps of where all these guns were in Perth. It was designed to frighten the population. And I said in Parliament, and I've said everywhere I go, you should always be concerned about a government that is trying to use fear to control the population. I mean, what the reality is on the risk of firearms in the community and what the government is telling you are two completely different things. Now, every firearms crime is a terrible crime. Every firearms crime is not to be tolerated. We hate every firearms crime. But in terms of the numbers and outcomes, it is not legitimate, honest, and regulated firearm owners who are the cause of the problem. They are just the soft target of a government scare campaign. And the legislation is bad. And it's because it's based on a fear campaign. The regulations are even worse, and we need to come to those at some point. But I think some of those groups, it's funny that the groups that were a little bit open to this change in the first instance, particularly some of those agricultural representatives groups and a number of others, when they were first, I guess, a bit bought off by the government, they didn't listen when I said the regulations are going to be worse. Now, here's a good example when we get to the regulatory debate. I was talking to a farmer who was mildly supportive of the changes because the government had convinced them that they weren't going to be severely impacted. They were a farmer. They could keep up to 10 firearms. Wasn't that going to be fine? And that was okay until the regulations dropped. And this person has got a number of firearms, including a semi-automatic shotgun, And so they suddenly find themselves, they've got to get a level C license, and they have to have level C safe capacity. So they've gone from a standard safe that you can purchase at the moment to the 6 to 10 millimeter version of it, which, as far as I'm aware, isn't available in Western Australia at the moment. The price of that is going to be moved from $1,000 to, well, the cheapest I can find at the moment is probably $4,000, but by the time everybody's trying to purchase it, it's probably going to be $6,000 to $8,000, and their license fee is going to shift up to over $700 a year. Now, this person who 6 months ago was telling me they don't think this is necessarily that bad, and I said, well, I can't vote for anything that I don't understand, and since the regulations aren't written, obviously nobody understands it yet, has suddenly got some buyer's remorse, Neil. And they're going, hang on a minute, the cost and the impact on me is significant. Now, this is a farmer. I suggest those farmers who were told, you're being exempted from all of this, you'll be grandfathered and you won't have to worry about this, are about to get some nasty letters in the mail going, hang on a minute, the cost to you in the first year alone could be anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000, and let's get ready for $1,000 a year in license fees. That's step number one before we start to deal with lots of the other problems that are written in the regulations. So exactly what I said has happened. When I said I can't support the legislation because this government has a history of making worse regulations, and that's why I can't support it, was absolutely borne out.
Made worse also by those SMSs that police kept sending out to gun owners and other. I mean, that was just disgraceful.
That was arrogant in the extreme. But again, that's what we've seen. So again, if you were simply trying to make sure that your gun laws were reasonably tight, yes, absolutely, but reasonable, there was no way that you would have sent those texts out. If your agenda was to take every firearm you could off every responsible, sensible, licensed firearm owner, then you would have sent those texts. And I think it simply proves what I've said all the way through, and that is you cannot trust the government that first off is trying to take away your ability to do what you've always done when you've not done the wrong thing, and secondly, they're using a fear campaign to do it.
Yeah. Now, in the wash up to this, we've seen, I think, parties, or at least the National and Liberal parties, position themselves ahead of the next election coming up in March. The Nationals have taken the view that they would repeal the Act. They originally said they'd repeal the regulations, but they tend to broaden that to be the Act. And I assume what they mean by that is that they'll go back to the old Act or something like that. The position of the Liberals is you seek a review of the legislation in Parliament. What's your view on those policies?
I think one of the issues, Neil, is that, as I said at the start, it's very hard to promise things that you probably can't deliver. And so, first off, for any of those things to occur, what we call the alliance in Western Australia has to win government. We're coming from a long way back. We also have to have both houses in a position to be open to that. And that's going to be very difficult. Even if you simply promise to disallow the regulations, which is the simplest of the versions, none of that's going to happen in the first half of next year. I mean, we go to an election on the 8th of March, unless Anthony Albanese changes that somehow and messes around with us. And then there's several weeks before the whole thing gets put together. By the time you get to a sitting, you're usually well into April, possibly into May, but probably into April. Now, bear in mind, there'll probably be a federal election in April that might get in the way as well. And then the first sitting week is really just here we are, getting together. Somebody eventually moves a disallowance motion on the regulations, and then it waits, I think, 5 sitting weeks until it's actually debated, which will probably take us well into the second half of next year. So any kind of commitment to say that anybody can deliver an immediate outcome, I think is, let's call it highly optimistic. So the technicalities are quite difficult, which is why it was so important to have the fight and the battle when the legislation was put up in the first instance. Like we needed the community more aware. We needed to get that message out. And look, despite some of us trying very hard to get that message out there that this was not to be trusted, we didn't get far enough. So there's still a lot of work to do, particularly around the media, to get that message out.
If you like this podcast, you can support the show by becoming a member of Politics Reloaded. Your support will help us get us interviews and information like this that shooters need to hear out to them. For more information, check out the show notes or go to politicsreloaded.com. Yeah, I think too that in a very almost perverse way, the government's actually done some of our work for us because they've really highlighted, they've put a big red circle around this issue for shooters. The SMS has gone out, the legislation is bad, it's primed for a political response if shooters can get themselves organised enough. And one of the things, I think one of the more powerful ways to actually demonstrate this to the government is to show public opposition. And we've actually trying to do that now through the holding of a rally in Perth in the 8th of February. And I'll just pop that up on the screen. Again, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but so the rally being organised is actually being started by shooters in Western Australia, but with assistance from others interstate who've done this sort of thing before. So mainly the Shooters Union. So it's being held on Saturday, the 8th of February, at Supreme Court Gardens, starting at 10:30. Now, what we've seen from the reaction so far has been nothing but a very real appetite for this. The original post by Shooters Union, I think, had something like nearly 700 shares on Facebook. I put a video out the other day on the safe things, which also backed the rally. That's had nearly 10,000 views, sort of thing. They're big numbers, and that tells us something. It tells us what the thirst is for something like this to happen. 1 month before the election.
Yeah, so I agree. I think this is really important. Can I say two things though, Neil? First off, obviously, a lot of people are required to make a statement, so obviously everybody should turn up. Secondly, those that do turn up, please bring a very somber and sober attitude to it. It is not the place for somebody to say something ridiculous, for somebody to be stupid, for somebody to go off on tangents. You know, I've been to a lot of rallies where people are passionate about something, and you have a range of views from the almost reluctant to say anything to the majority who are quietly angry, to a few people who occasionally go out there and say something absolutely crazy. And I can tell you which one gets on the television, Neil.
Yeah.
It's always a crazy statement. So for those that are going to go out there, can we please make sure that we are delivering a succinct message that is sensible and somber and sober and all of those things, where this is an attack on honest, law-abiding firearms owners by those of the socialist left. It doesn't have to be political, but it just needs to be a show of strength and a show of force. The number of people will be far more important than somebody being able to say something outrageous to get themselves on television. So for everybody that goes, let's keep this message on track.
Yeah, that's a real issue which the organising committee has worked through. If we look back at '96, what happened there with the marches, and even before then in the '80s, a lot of people there, the same concerns were raised. They actually turned out really well. This one, don't worry, we're on top of it. We've working with WA Police on this, so and we've got marshals and everything's organised. So glass half full. It's going to be a good day and an important day to get that message out. And I think. Look, the bottom line in this all the way through is going to be shooters are going to vote Labor out. Yes. That's the message. It's not hard to do. It's easy to do. If you vote, not only if you vote properly, but if you remember to vote properly, because one of the bugbears of mine is that people tend to, they know about these things, they hear about these things, but they, the polling day comes and they think, I've just got to go to Bunnings and pick up some, Dex Dane, and I've just got to pick up the kids, and I'll vote on the way through, and they just do what they did last time, or what the father did, whatever it is, and they wonder why the laws, why they've never been taken seriously.
Oh, that's right. There's an old adage that says you can blame the politicians, but more often than not, we get the politicians we deserve. So that might be a bit inflammatory. But if you don't take your vote seriously, where do we go?
Yeah, so voting for the Liberal Party in the lower house is pretty straightforward. You number your boxes 1 through to 5, 7, whatever many there are. You got a number every box. Voting in the upper house. Now, the upper house has changed, I think, since the last election. How do people make sure they vote properly in the upper house?
So it'll be a bit like the Senate vote, where above or below the line, you don't have to fill out every box, but you have to fill out a certain number. So when you go in there, they'll tell you as you walk into the polling booth. In many cases, if they tell you to vote 1 to 10, then you vote 1 to 10 basically for the parties of your choice. If you go below the line, it's a much bigger number, but you still have to then only fill out that particular number of votes. So it'll look a bit like the Senate, where, yes, it'll be the upper house will be this enormously big paper. But the reality is, if you're only voting a certain number, then you don't have to know what some more smaller and more interesting single-purpose parties are actually there for. So it's absolutely critical to work out what your range of preferences are.
You've got to read the names of the parties carefully too, because sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion between who the.
So Western Australia passed an urgent piece of legislation right at the end of the sitting in November to actually remove some of that confusion, where you won't get quite as many things. Now, I think that might have been specifically because the government didn't like something like the Democratic Labor Party. But in reality, that will be a little bit less difficult than it used to be. But no, it is absolutely critically important. I think it's important to find out what your local candidate stands for, what they believe in, and make an effort. I mean, in every election, particularly in every lower house seat, you can go through and work out who you think should be elected based on the advertising that comes through your mailbox. Or you can make something of an effort to work out who your best candidate actually is. And I'm always a big believer democracy works when people make an effort to find out what their local candidate stands for. In relation to gun laws is a prime example. What does your local candidate think, and what will they do or say if they get elected into Parliament?
Yeah, just something you mentioned, just the start of that goes back to something that I was saying before, which is the time that you take to fill in the ballot paper properly. Don't do it in 30 seconds. Take a couple of minutes, read it, and then vote. It's only a couple of minutes out of your time, but it makes all the difference in the world.
It's critically important.
Okay, Steve Thomas from the Liberal Party in WA, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Neil.
Okay, no worries. And just remember, vote Labor out. I think that's the parting message.
Absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Gun News Australia. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and that you're on our email list. And don't forget to check the episode notes, because that's where you'll find out how to support the show. We'll see you in the next episode of Gun News Australia, brought to you by Politics Reloaded.